Hi, I'm here to go over topic 3.8, the Constitutional Convention and debates over ratification. So this chapter starts out with a quote from Benjamin Franklin. He says, "Thus I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best." Not exactly a glowing review of the Constitution from one of our founding fathers, Ben Franklin. And this topic, is going to talk about the various compromises that the Constitution went through to get to be what was actually ratified or approved. And so Ben Franklin's quote gets to the idea that not all states were completely satisfied with what ended up being ratified, but they recognized that it was good enough, so to speak, or was something that was kind of the best it could be. So the big meeting that decides what to put in the Constitution is called the Constitutional Convention. But there are kind of two smaller meetings leading up to that. The first is Mount Vernon, where George Washington was like, "Hey, buddies, come on over. Let's talk about the Constitution." And they were like, "Yeah." Once they got there, they're like, "Yeah, we should probably just talk about this more." And so they had what's called the Annapolis Convention. And then they were like, "Yeah, we need to talk about this more. There are bigger issues." And they had the Constitutional Convention. So representatives from all states except for Rhode Island, who was apparently too good or not trusting, got together. We know these people who wrote the Constitution as the founding fathers. And there were a number of different debates. There are a few different debates. The first was kind of this central idea that was the impetus or the cause of the Articles of Confederation, is how strong to make this central government or this national government. And they settled on this idea overall of federalism, which is different from the Confederation, because that was it was like there was no central power. But federalism, there's a central power that has strong but limited power. And so it's limited by what we call separation of powers. So we have the three branches: executive, judicial, and legislative. And we also have checks and balances between those three powers. So no one branch can have more power than the others. And so they were like, "Yeah, there's no king. We have these checks and balances, these separation of powers. Seems like that will work better than the Articles of Confederation." Cool. The rest of the decisions were not that easy. Because the next question was, well, how many representatives should we have? And there were some big states like Virginia and Pennsylvania who said, well, the number of representatives we should have in Congress should be based on how many people we have. That's only fair. And then the smaller states like New Jersey were like, whoa, that is not fair. We are smaller. It's not our fault that we're smaller. We should have equal representation. And so there ended up being these two plans, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. And the Virginia plan said it should be based on how many people you have. The Virginia plan was more popular with larger states because the more people you have, the more representation you get, the more power you have. But smaller states favored what was called the New Jersey plan, which said that every state should have equal representation. And so if you know anything about our government and our legislature and Congress, you know that these plans were put together in what's called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. So we have one house. The House of Representatives is based on population, and the Senate, everyone has equal representation. So Virginia and New Jersey both got a little piece of their plan put together into the Great Compromise. Nice. And the next one is not so pleasant. It's about slavery. And the two questions about slavery were, well, now that we have representation decided, should slaves count towards that? And then another question about the slave trade, like, should that be allowed to continue? And so in terms of representation, it's kind of a little bit backwards, because you'd think that Southern states, who are the ones who have slaves, would not consider them people. But they're not dumb, these Southern states, and they say, well, if we count all of our slaves as people, we will have more representation in the House of Representatives. So therefore, Congress, our slaves are people. They count in our population for representation. And the Northern states were like, no. Though you do not consider those people, they do not get to count as people here. Also, we don't have slaves, and so that will make it unfair to us. Another compromise occurred called the 3/5 compromise. That's a fraction 3/5. And there are a couple different ways to kind of think about it or explain it. But the most basic is that every slave kind of lists 3/5 of a person. So if you take the total number of enslaved people in, say, South Carolina, you multiply that by 3/5 or 0.6, and that's how many people you get to count towards your calculation for representation. You can also think of it as for every 5 slaves, 3 of them counted towards the representation count. Either way you slice it, it's a really horrible way to talk about human beings by saying they're 3/5 of a person, 3 out of 5 count. None of this actually takes into consideration the humanity of enslaved people as people. It's really just about power in Congress and the two competing sides, North and South. The other part of the slavery debate was about the slave trade, and they were basically like, we can't decide, so it can continue until 1808. So that's 20 years. They're like, we'll just talk about it again in 20 years. Okay, one more compromise. Commercial compromise, not super complicated. And what we'll talk about as we go deeper into the new nation is that the North becomes more industrial, less reliant on big farms. And so they have to import more. And the South produces a lot. They have a lot of plantations and farms, and so they export more. And so the North wanted protections on what they were going to be importing, and they wanted Congress to have a say in that to make sure it was fair. The South didn't want their exports to be taxed. Voila, the commercial compromise says that Congress will regulate interstate commerce, including taxes on imports, but no taxes on exports. This is the commercial compromise, and it's important mainly because if you remember, the Articles of Confederation had no power in terms of money, taxes, trade, any of that. So it clearly says this is what the government does. They also set up the electoral college system, which has to do with the presidency, and it's how we elect the president. States vote. They have a certain number of electors, or kind of a different sort of representative, who then vote for the president. So those are that's kind of what they lay out, and that's what they put forth to Congress to say, hey, we think you should ratify or approve this and make this the new law of the land. And throughout the ratification process, or the process of approval, there were 2 main sides, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were in favor of a stronger central government. They wanted a stronger federal government, federal meaning central or national. The Anti-Federalists did not want a strong central government. They thought that that was not what they fought for in the Revolution. It was dangerous. It would lead to a monarchy or a dictatorship or something of that line. So they were anti-strong federal government. There's a chart on page 126 that kind of lays out both sides, but that's essentially their argument, and then it gets into a little bit of their strategies and so on. So these are the 2 sides in the debate. So the Federalists think that this is a really good constitution. The Anti-Federalists think it gives too much power to the central or federal government and not enough power to the people. And so as this is going on, some Federalists in secret, namely Alexander Hamilton, known from the musical, John Jay and James Madison, write these essays called the Federalist Papers, trying to convince the states to ratify. But it ultimately came down to another sort of compromise, and this is where we have the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So it's things like freedom of speech, right to petition. All of those first 10 amendments were actually a compromise, and they're amendments, right, because they were changed. They were a change to the Constitution. And so the Anti-Federalists said, we're not comfortable with the Constitution unless it lays out specific rights and freedoms that people have. The Federalists, argued, well, the people elect the representatives, and so therefore the people do have the power and the freedoms. But ultimately, the Anti-Federalists kind of convinced the state delegates enough that the Bill of Rights was adopted. And so this is the last sort of compromise of the Constitution. And once the Bill of Rights is adopted, that's the first 10 amendments, the Constitution finally gets ratified. Let's see. North Carolina and Rhode Island were the last two states to ratify the Constitution in 1790 and have it become law. So a lot of compromises going into the Constitution, right? About representation, about slavery, about personal freedoms and the Bill of Rights, about federalism. And these are all really important parts of the Constitution, say a lot. These compromises say a lot about who Americans were at the time and what they wanted their country to be. And so when you go back to Ben Franklin's quote at the start of the topic chapter, when he's talking about agreeing or liking the Constitution because he expects no better and because he's not sure it's the best, it's not that he has no hope for America, but it's that he has faith in the compromises that they've made being ultimately the most good for the most people rather than the best for any one person or any one state. And that is largely what our Constitution is founded on. Most good for the most people.